Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Voices for Justice in Academia, the fight against genocide and scholasticide in Gaza, hosted by the Institute for Palestine Studies, USA. My name is Jihad Abu Salim. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Palestine Studies, USA, office based here in Washington, D.C., and I will be your host and moderator for today's conversation. I want to start by thanking you all for being here for this critical discussion, especially our distinguished panelists who have generously taken the time to join us. The scale of destruction inflicted upon Gaza's education sector is nothing short of catastrophic. Over the past 15 months, Israeli bombardment has obliterated nearly 1,200 educational institutions, including 930 schools, universities, kindergartens, and learning centers. Entire pillars of knowledge and opportunity have been reduced to rubble by Israeli bombs. The assault has not only decimated infrastructure, but has also stolen lives, with nearly 13,000 students and 800 teachers, educators, and administrative staff killed in Gaza. Every university in Gaza has suffered immense damage, some entirely wiped off the map, leaving a generation without classrooms, books, or even the faintest sense of academic continuity. The loss is not just physical. It is an assault on the very existence of Palestinian education and Palestinian life. Current estimates indicate that the value of this loss amounts to over $2 billion in damage. Opportunity and hope for Palestinians in Gaza and beyond. This is not merely destruction. It is, as UN experts have warned, an educational genocide, a scholasticide, a systematic attempt to dismantle Palestinian education by targeting its institutions, educators, and students. The Institute for Palestine Studies has created the Gaza Education Destruction Database in Arabic, which hopefully soon will be available in English, a database that documents this unprecedented assault on education and provides accurate information, media archives, and testimonies from those who have endured this catastrophe. Education is not just about going to school for a certain period of time in people's lives. It is the foundation of people's future. So when schools and universities are destroyed, so too are the dreams and potential of an entire generation. What we witness today in Gaza is not just the targeting of buildings, but an effort to extinguish the intellectual and cultural life and resilience of Palestinians themselves. This event comes at a pivotal moment. This event is not about recounting the scale of destruction on the ground in Gaza, but rather it is about our responsibility as academics, scholars, and people who are part of academic institutions here in the United States and in the Western world in general. Today, we are going to talk about this year's American Historical Association annual conference, in which members overwhelmingly voted to pass a resolution condemning the scholasticide in Gaza. However, the AHA's top leadership later vetoed this resolution, citing concerns about neutrality and institutional mission, despite the fact that the American Historical Association has taken clear political positions in the past, including on the war in Ukraine. This event also is happening at a time when the assault on students and educators are also ever expanding beyond Gaza's boundaries, in the West Bank, as Israel's aggression continues, but also here in the United States and in Europe, where we are witnessing unprecedented levels of criminalization, suppression, and assaults on educators and students. Beyond the vetoing of this single resolution at the American Historical Association, we know that academic suppression, censorship, and institutional complicity have long been barriers to Palestinian advocacy in higher education. Today, I'm honored to discuss what that means, why calls for solidarity often go unanswered, and what scholars and institutions should be doing to resist these injustices. I am honored to be joined by an incredible panel of scholars whose work has been critical to the understanding of Palestine's history, especially within the framework of settler colonialism and through telling the many stories of Palestinian resistance and defiance. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Mazna Qatu, who teaches history at the University of Cambridge, where she also directs the Margaret Anstey Center for Global Studies. Dr. Qatu co-convenes the Archives of the Disappeared Research Network and is completing a history of education for Palestinians. I'm also honored to welcome Dr. Shireen Saiqali, who is a fellow of the Wissenschaftkolleg zu Berlin 2024-2025 and associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her book, Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine, published by Stanford University Press in 2016, explores economy, territory, the home, and the body. Her forthcoming book, From Baltimore to Beirut, on the question of Palestine, tells a global history of capital, slavery, and disposition. She is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UCSP, co-editor of the Stanford Studies Middle Eastern and Islamic Societies and Cultures series, and co-editor of Jadaliyya. And finally, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Asmat Al-Halabi, who is a historian of colonialism and anti-colonialism. He is an assistant professor of transnational history at the University of Toronto. His first book, Parting Gifts of Empire, Palestine and India at the Dawn of Decolonization, is forthcoming from the University of California Press. Some housekeeping rules before we begin. This is a Zoom webinar, so all audience members will be muted. If you have questions for the panelists, please submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will be selecting questions from the audience during the later part of the event. Today's discussion will be structured around 3 rounds of questions that I will address to the speakers, followed by a Q&A session for the audience. So let me begin by going back to the American Historical Association veto. As I mentioned, AHA's council vetoed the resolution condemning scholasticide in Gaza, despite an overwhelming vote, 428 to 88, in its favor at the conference. Dr. Razna, Dr. Shireen, and Dr. Asmat were there. I was supposed to be there, but I couldn't join. AHA's justification was that it fell outside the association's mission and that the situation in Gaza is not settled history, even though AHA has previously taken clear stances, such as on the war in Ukraine. Additionally, some council members argued that adopting such a resolution could alienate scholars who support Israel. So my question for our panelists: what does the AHA's veto reveal about the complicity of academic bodies in suppressing Palestinian voices, the limits of internal democratic processes within these institutions, and the ways, quote-unquote, neutrality is weaponized to sustain structural inequities within these institutions? And of course, I forgot to welcome you all to this panel, so welcome, and the floor is all yours.
So are we going to we're going to do each answer this question in part? Yeah? That's what we agreed to do? Okay, so I think that what this resolution, the passing of the resolution and then the council's veto of it really gives us lessons on the one hand, the Palestine exception, and on the other hand, the condition of higher education more broadly. And I think the Palestine exception with the American Historical Association is a really clear one in the sense that historically, this association, which is the oldest continuous existing learned society in the United States, has always had a kind of troubled and fraught relationship to what is the role of the historian and what does it mean to be political. And as Barbara Weinstein, who is a former chair of the AHA and who was one of the people who spoke on behalf of the resolution during the business meeting, she just came out with a piece called "What is the Role of the Historian?" And it gives a really useful history of the American Historical Association and how and why this resolution is a rupture. So what's interesting about this association is that during the Vietnam era, during the Vietnam War era, a bunch of historians really tried to get passed a resolution condemning the US war on Vietnam, and they were unable to do that. And this speaks to the longer kind of history of white dominance in the American Historical Association. And as a hint to that white dominance, we can look at the list of former AHA presidents, which included Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Alfred Thayer Mann, who's the person who coined the term the Middle East, Frederick Jackson Turner. So there's a kind of long history of that. What's interesting is that the rupture that happened in AHA history around the resolution, around resolutions, actually comes around 2003 in the early 2000s, in the wake of the George W. Bush administration and the war on Iraq, and the ostensible war on terror. So it was in 2007 that the AHA kind of shifted gears and passed a resolution at the business meeting. And I looked up the numbers of that vote because I think it's interesting compared to the numbers of the Scholasticide resolution. And in a vote from 1,550 to 498, so about 75% in support, the AHA said what's happening in Iraq goes against the pursuit of historical knowledge. It is against the conduct and the principles of the AHA. And we're calling on our membership to take, quote, to take a public stand as citizens on behalf of the values necessary to the practice of our profession, and to, quote, do whatever we can to bring the Iraq war to a speedy conclusion. This is a really good resolution to think about in comparison to the Scholasticide resolution, which in fact was a very basic one. And I'll quote here Barbara Weinstein again to say, these are her words exactly, quote, "There was no reference in the text of the resolution to genocide. There was no call for a boycott of Israel or Israeli institutions. Even the issue of intent was left somewhat ambiguous in this resolution, being mentioned only in a quote from a statement of UN experts, quote unquote." So the two reasons I think that account for this repressive and cowardly veto that we saw from the AHA Council, which we should also remember was not in consensus. There were 4 people who voted against that veto, is I think the Palestine exception. And the Palestine exception is something our audiences know deeply about. And it basically, I think, is a way to deem our very existence and our claim to history as racists. Basically, Palestinian scholars and students and the many people who have been struggling alongside us for Palestinian liberation have sort of been taking center stage in the last 15 months of genocide, and our speech and our words have become targets of securitization. This is, of course, something we're familiar with for decades, but has been escalating both with the IRA resolution as well as which deems any critique of Israel as a form of racism, but also more intensified with the global opposition to Israel and the United States genocide. And I think that one of the things that we saw at the AHA business meeting was the coming together of the Palestine exception and the eroding condition of higher education more broadly. And that is a condition wherein neoliberal governance has, through austerity, attenuated our universities, our curriculum, our faculty governance, especially in public institutions, and at the same time that we have seen the ways that the Trump administration will continue to further that attenuation. And so what we saw at the AHA business meeting was a lot of, in the people who opposed the Scholasticide, was on the one hand, racism and erasure of Palestine. So again, the Palestinian condition. And at the same time, a real fear that using the excuse that the Trump administration is going to come after us, so we can't take a risk by taking an ethical position. And this was what our colleagues talked about in terms of anticipatory obedience. And I think here, what Palestinian scholars in Gaza teach us is that we should not run to be obedient, that the dangers of the future that we are already, that the dangers of the future have already arrived in our present.
Thank you, Shireen. Dr. Mazna, Dr. Asmat, feel free to chip in.
Asmat, you look like you had thoughts.
Well, I would just say one thing, and two things, but two short things that are interesting to add and that we should note is that at that business meeting, the end of the day, the vast majority of the people voted for the resolution, right? And this is something that is being totally ignored and something that institutions, including the American Historical Association, but also the Modern Language Association, also yesterday the International Studies Association wouldn't allow a BDS resolution to go up. At all these levels, they're really fighting against their membership in the same way that the US government, the Israeli government are fighting against the global majority and the fact that the vast majority of the people on this planet support the Palestinian people because their cause, of course, is just. And one thing that was interesting in the debate that took place at the AHA with regard to this Palestine exception was the way that, of course, Palestinian history is denied and so on, but there is this way that, of course, Palestinians are transfigured into into anti-Semites, right? The perpetrators of the Holocaust in Europe. I mean, this is essentially what was being said, and this is essentially what we're constantly sort of fighting and writing against, because this is an incredibly hostile situation that gets taken up at the historiographical level, the institutional level, and the political level, and it's a huge scandal.
Yeah, one note that occurred to me while I was sitting there in the front row watching the leadership seethe, burn with rage at its own membership is the astonishing lack of democracy within that room. Running roughshod over a membership that had, in all good faith, submitted a resolution, crossed their T's, dotted their I's. And as Shireen mentioned, and, you know, kept it as essentially, you know, toothless as they could without, you know, but it is on Palestine, as Ismat says, right? So it's always going to threaten. So there's this astonishing, there's astonishing moment where you watched a resolution, in fact, be this expression, actually, of faith in an institution that was decaying from the inside out. That this resolution actually is a kind of a Hail Mary for an institution that has, for decades now, and certainly in the last 20 years, seen fit to ignore the enormous precarity of most of its membership, the decay and the disintegration of support for history and historical scholarship in North America, and particularly in the United States. And this was saying, you need a moral backbone by which to, you know, speak politically. And there is no stronger backbone to have or develop or to build but through Palestine in this moment, at least in this moment. And they refused. And that is an indictment on that leadership more than anyone else. It is certainly not an indictment on the 400 plus who came, who paid despite their precarity, who invested in this resolution as a result, and came to that meeting and voted in support of it.
And if I might, Jihad, I want to just add one thing inspired by Asmat and Mezna, which is also the way that what that room felt like. So yeah, I mean, the difference between the Iraq resolution and the Scholasticide resolution is that 75% of the voters voted for the Iraq resolution, but we had over 82% at the Scholasticide resolution voting for it. And the room itself felt different. Many of us have not felt the AHA as a space that we can exist in, that makes sense to us. The last AHA I went to in January of 2024 was really, I mean, it felt like an alternate planet, because it was 4 months into the genocide and it was as if nothing was happening and there was no Palestine in the panels or in any of the discussion. And so I think one of the things, exactly as Mezna is saying, is that the room felt like a demand for a different kind of future. And the leadership of the AHA tried to justify their acts, their anti-democratic act, by saying we are protecting the institution, but in fact they're burying the institution. And the thing that I just want to point to is James Grossman, who is the outgoing executive director of the AHA, recently did a critique, a pretty powerful critique of the White House's executive order, which is called, quote, "Ending Radical Indoctrination in K through 12 Schooling." And along with other historians, David Wright and Beth English, they argued that this order would undermine the integrity of writing and teaching of American history. And the title of the piece is "Trump Wishes to Abolish the Past, We Historians Will Not." And it's very ironic, right? Because you can say exactly the same thing about what we were trying to propose with the Scholasticide, that Israel, with the aid and arming and international impunity of the United States, has attempted at every turn to destroy the Palestinian past. And we historians will not let that happen.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Mazna and Asma, do you have anything else you'd like to add? There's an interesting back and forth happening in the chat. I can't help but follow it as I'm listening to you. And I would like to encourage everyone to bring these questions up to our speakers using the Q&A feature, because the chat keeps on moving and I won't be able to catch up with everything that is being said there. But there is a discussion amongst the attendees about democratic practices in general. Are vetoes even something that needs to continue in the present? And of course, some are talking about what different measures members of an association like the American Historical Association can do and adopt in order to engage in efforts to defy and resist these top-down vetoes and anti-Palestinian steps that are taken by the association. And we can discuss these things, but I want to highlight that while today's event is about AHA's resolution and the veto against it, it also speaks to the entire scene within the educational world today. The Palestine has become a battlefield in the academy, within institutional educational institutions, where important people are fighting back against many forms of suppression, silencing of the voices of educators and students, and of course there is an assault on research itself and academic integrity, and an effort, an organized effort to dictate even the scholarly agenda around Palestine. We will get back to this point, but before I do so, I wanted to highlight this letter that was issued by Palestinian academics and university administrators in Gaza during the genocide, in which they called for global resistance against Israel's destruction of educational institutions and demanded that international academic bodies take an active role in rebuilding education in Gaza. But despite this urgent appeal and many other appeals by Palestinian educators and students, responses from Western academic institutions have been, those who positively reacted, their responses have been largely symbolic. We haven't seen serious material in responses in terms of support for our colleagues on the ground and measures to address the complicity of institutions here. And I want to bring to take the opportunity here to talk about the letter, which is shared now in the chat, and ask, why do these calls from Palestinian academics are so often ignored? It's not like Palestinian academics and writers and authors and scholars and historians aren't actively seeking to be part of this broader world of knowledge production and connections. But they're always faced, whether during the genocide or before, and even now, they're always faced with this selective inaction. So what does this selective inaction reveal about our institutions here? And what are some of the ideological, political, or institutional barriers that prevent a stronger response? I mean, we talked about the specific example of AHA, but we're talking about a larger structural issue here. And of course, since we're in a panel with historians, if you could mention previous examples of, Palestinian academics and scholars reaching out and or engage in efforts to address these problems, that would be appreciated. The floor is all yours again.
Maybe I can just start. So I feel like Jihad, there's two pieces to the questions that you were asking, but I'd like to also fold in some of the questions within the chat about why a decision was made to make a resolution at the AHA, and given the veto, why has, what would it look like to potentially withdraw from the AHA as an act of opposition, as an act of dissent, etc., perhaps to start another organization, what have you. This was a extensive conversation that happened actually by the Historians for Peace and Democracy as they were drafting this resolution, but certainly in the aftermath of the veto, amongst a sort of formation that is still in development that has grown tremendously called Historians for Palestine. And Historians for Palestine deliberated amongst themselves about the path forward. And the general consensus has been there is an argument to be made that withdrawing one's membership from the AHA, so many, I mean, there was also a question on numbers. The numbers of the AHA anyway had been largely shrinking as a result of this feeling of disenfranchisement from institutional historical, institutions of history in the United States for various reasons that we've already described. But there was a point made that one does not concede a fight. Insofar as we want to take this fight to the AHA, we still have leverage. We have the leverage of the vote, the 82% who voted in that room, and the larger question of democracy and the role of membership. So that was the decision, right? That does not leave off the table, potentially in the future, should this strategic, move, should the AHA Council remain obstinate, that is not off the table, right? But for now, the idea is this is the institution for historians in the United States. It must answer to and fulfill the will of its membership. And the will of its membership very clearly articulated a request to take this resolution to a vote. That's it. At some point, those who are active in proposing and pushing forward this resolution and actions that will then be required as a result of this resolution being adopted might make a different decision with the involvement of fellow historians and scholars as well. But that's the decision as it stands now. Shireen, maybe you wanted to come in as well if you had other thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what Asmat was saying also about a kind of global will. And I think that there are different kinds of strategies, and that the people who are organizing Historians for Peace and Democracy, which is an older organization that started out as Historians Against the War that began in 2003, and Historians for Palestine have been mobilizing. People have been working to bring the change in the room. And as Mazna said, less people have been coming to the AHA because it's expensive and people are precarious. And so the spirit of the room, right? And when we walked into the room, I think at least the way that I felt was this room is ours. People are going to vote for this resolution. And after the resolution passed, there was so much joy in the room. For every single person who stood up to speak on behalf of the resolution, people give standing ovations to. To see that ground is exactly what the leadership who vetoed the resolution want, because they want to believe and that we are just imposters who will go away, that we just came in because of this resolution and that we're just going to be safely put away. And I don't think that's the case. And I think one of the reasons it's not the case is what Mesna was saying earlier, which is that Palestine stands for many things to many people. And as our dear friend and colleague Ahmed Shukr was saying, standing against scholasticide in Palestine is also a way to think about and stand against the erosion of higher education in the United States and in other places. So I think those connections are being made. And I think to begin to respond to your question about, well, why haven't people taken up this call from Palestinian scholars in Gaza? And how do we understand the kind of politics of invisibility in a way? And I think that's a really important challenge that we should think about. And I think that institutions like IPS and institutions, like the Librarians and Archivists with Palestine that Mesna is a leader of, and so many other institutions have really been pushing the envelope against a kind of economy that marginalizes and invisibilizes Palestinian voices. And I think there is much, much more to do. And it is a constant labor, even within sometimes mobilizing spaces. So I think that that's something that we need to think about and challenge. At the same time that I also really want to remind everyone that the movements that we saw in the last 15 months on university campuses are building on a longer tradition of campus organizing. And in many ways, the campus organizing against boycott, divestment, and sanctions was, in fact, a response to a Palestinian call of civil society organizations that really in many ways shifted the terms of the debate in university spaces, and that allowed for this kind of movement to consolidate and grow.
To this question of why there has been limited response in North America or the West to the calls for support emanating from Gaza and from Palestinians. I think the fundamental problem is that for the West, Palestinian intellectual is oxymoron. Palestinian intellectuals don't exist. A Palestinian university is just a base for weapons or whatever, a library. There's no, I mean, if you look at the Israeli discourse, which of course is mimicked endlessly in the American discourse, Palestinians are dogs and so on. And so why would they need support for their education, right? And even among some of the specialists, the Israeli Orientalists, let's say, right, who can't deny the presence of Palestinian education, there's a whole industry, right, which denigrates that educational process, right? That it is again anti-Semitic, it is Islamist, it is nationalist, it is whatever it is. And of course, this is not exclusive to Palestinians, right? This is the colonial view, right? How many American intellectuals, right, are going on about, that's not a novel, and where's the Zulu Tolstoy, whatever it is. I mean, this is the air that these people breathe, right? When the leadership of the AHA or the MLA are talking about Palestine in this way, that's because they don't see Palestinians as people with ideas, right? As people capable of producing thought, right? They are merely terrorists, or on the other hand, they're simply victims of some violence, and they're in need of humanitarian assistance. So when Gaza's scholars are saying it's just our buildings that have been destroyed, our universities are here in the people, right? And these people who have devoted their lives to study, who devoted their lives to teaching, students who have devoted their lives to that work. And we don't need, we don't need a plan from you, right? We just need you not to work against us, right? We need some support when you're not working against us, right? And of course, the response on the part of many American universities has been not to support Palestinian universities or Palestinian scholars. It's to actually ratchet up the support for Israeli institutions, for Israeli universities, right? The idea that Gaza has world-class teachers like Asma Ramadan Mustafa or world-class historians like Salim Arafat Mubayyad, rest in peace, right? That's completely beyond anyone leading the AHA or the MLA, the ISA or whatever, or the United States for that matter, right?
And Salim Arafat al-Mbayyad passed away during the war, while I believe displaced and struggling with illness. And I agree with you, Asmat, and as someone who I have been in both worlds. I studied in Gaza. I went to college there. I studied at two universities in Gaza. I worked at a third. The three of them have been bombed. One actually has been completely erased from the face of the earth, the University of Palestine, in which I studied and where I worked for more than a year, and two of my siblings finished their degrees there. I just want to add that to what you just said, that this disregard for Palestinian institutions of knowledge and for Palestinian knowledge production, this refusal to learn the names of our intellectuals, of our historians, this attitude to pretend that our institutions and educators and scholars do not exist, is something that did not start with this genocide and did not begin with using October 7th as a justification for unleashing these levels of anti-Palestinian racism. Education in Gaza, like the rest of the Palestinian society in Gaza, has been under siege for the past 17 years. I'm not aware of any serious effort on the part of academic institutions here in the United States, maybe, in Europe on the level of individuals, to challenge and defy the blockade on Gaza that prevented people from opportunities, caused scholars and students to lose their scholarships, miss important travel deadlines, prevented the entry and exit of books and publications, and deprived us, those who are here, from accessing knowledge production in Gaza as well. We don't know what books have been published. Asmat, if at some point you could talk a little bit about Salim Arafat al-Mbayyad and his work, which has been incredible in terms of, documenting and writing about Palestinian history. So this is a century-long process of disregard and dismissal. Before I continue, I wanted to ask Mazna, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just a couple of other thoughts. First about, I think there's several pieces happening at the same time, several dynamics happening at the same time in this moment, but also historically when it comes to the question of intellectuals, scholars, scholarship, education, broadly, higher and mandatory, 20th century mandatory education in Palestine writ large, but also in Gaza. The first, I think, let's remind ourselves that in part, there is an erasure of these scholars, but in part also these scholars are a threat. These scholars and students and education for Palestinians across the 20th century has been understood as a site for social, political mobilization and mobility, and as such must be cordoned off and must be contained. That has been the project that has aimed to cordon the promise of Palestinian education and transform it into a kind of subjugation. The refusal of Palestinians to toe that line at every scale, as scholars, as students, as teachers, as educators, and to build institutions has been a long-running thorn in the side of Zionism, whose narrative completely, as Esmat, is built upon this rejection of the sort of the social and intellectual worlds of the Palestinian people. And second, though, I think it's also important to honor and to think about all those scholars now and in our history across the world who have seen kinship both with the Palestinian struggle and with Palestinian scholarship, both in the global South, in the global majority, and in global minority countries. And that these scholars saw in Palestine a linchpin for thinking differently, thinking radically, thinking transformatively about world making, about the kinds of futures we all desire collectively to have. And many of them have paid a brutal price, both in terms of their careers, in terms of their voice, in terms of their very lives. And so it's important to also say in this moment of erasure and the continued history of our erasure that there are those who are willing to be erased with us. And that this is a kind of internationalism that is at the beating heart of Palestinian intellectual production. Finally, there is a moment now, right, where there is a distinction too between thinking about individuated figures of intellectual production as historians, but also students and whatever it is, the scholarly world, the Palestinian scholarly universe, right? And thinking about the institutions that have been crafted by Palestinians. And so here I think Palestinians, because this is their struggle and because this movement to refuse the education as a subjugatory space, understood very quickly that educational institutions will be the first target for destruction, or one of the key targets for destruction at every scale. UNRWA schools, the Ministry of Education was decimated, entire registries of student curricula and records gone, right? But also the universities in this kind of incredibly spectacular show. It was spectacular, right? On purpose. The Israeli state spectacularly blew up Al-Isra, Al-Azhar, And that was on purpose because it was sending a message to them as institutions. You built these institutions with your very sweat and blood and the struggle of so many people. As the Gaza Emergency Committee said, we started from tents, we'll go back 2 tents, right? And so for us to now say that the point is not, individual projects of honoring scholars is crucial, but the movement must be centered at building up Palestinian institutional strength, which was always inextricable from movements and movement work. Because the idea precisely is to reject this idea of the wandering Palestinian intellectual. No, we situate ourselves within Palestinian institutions who have a particular project, peoplehood as a project that is produced and whose key engine is these institutions, is these educational institutions. So we must protect them and we must support them and be in solidarity with them. And I say this in direct response to 2 of those who opposed the resolution during the business meeting, who talked about how, the Palestinians did not call for this solidarity, but we should focus on humanitarianism. An outrageous lie, right? www.gazauniversities.org. One of the first things that Palestinians did was issue a call for institutional support for education. And the fact that this is a race as well, not merely Palestinians as intellectuals, but Palestinians as institutional builders, is an extraordinary illusion of peoplehood and the project of peoplehood. Sorry, that's my rant. Thank you.
No,
I'll
this
just
is
add one small point, which
please,
is
Shireen, please.
that brings together, I think, what Asmat and Mazna were saying, which is that the people who actually none of the people who opposed the resolution called us Palestinians.
Mhm.
They said Gazans. And none of them said the word Palestine. And I think those people are still in the tradition of we don't exist and we are things that can be easily swept away without trouble. And we know this rhetoric because it's at the very foundation of the Zionist enterprise. But the 482 people who were in the room completely oppose that rhetoric, right? So I think we have to also balance between the erasure and the immense invitation and offering that Palestine and Palestinians are at the center of right now. And I think there is that, that balance between being stripped of everything and the kind of power that we have. And I think within that, because when you said jihad, well, no institution has taken up the call. Most of educational institutions have abandoned everyone. You know what I mean? So I think it's also the potential for the why Palestine organizing is a threat is precisely because exactly as Mesna was saying earlier, it's a demand on institutions to stand for their own membership, which they have not been doing.
No, thank you, Shireen. Asmat, any thoughts on this?
Sorry, what time do we end? I just don't want to take all the time left. It's not at noon, right?
We,
So I will say something.
but up
My
to you
one
guys
thing
if you want to stick
that
around for 3 hours. Yeah, I don't personally.
the one thing I will say, especially with regard to what was just said, is there are a lot of people who are those 400 something in the room, those people around the world who have supported Palestine and lost their lives for it in the last century, right? There is a risk, right? And you might lose your job. You might not get a job. You might not be able to publish certain things, right? Sometimes people ask me like, well, I'm worried that if I say this or if I do this, I might get in trouble, right? Like students will come and ask me, and I tell them that yeah, you might. I mean, this is the situation. There's people uh, dying, right? There's people being killed. This is a international struggle, and people play the role that they want to play, right? And there is a role for people who want to be anonymous and so on, and I'm about that, and I respect that. But if you're gonna say something under your name, or if you're gonna, like a lot of the students who recognize that they were taking risks, right, and continue to do it, right, at Princeton University right now, the administration is trying to get the students to put all the blame on one student, right, and so that the other dozen students won't get in trouble, and they're not willing to take that kind of uh, targeting, right? They're like, no, we're all in this together, right? So there is a risk, right? We call it out, we write about it, we make our case to those institutions, we do all the things when we try to protect the people who are most precarious, but this is a struggle for life and death, right? At bottom, and we should keep that in the forefront of our minds when we do this work, especially those of us who are near the top, right, of a global academic hierarchy, right? And we have a lot more resources and a lot more access, certainly scholars from Gaza, but around the world, right? And I think, if you think that that's a kind of responsibility, then you have to take it on and you have to take the risk. I mean, someone like Mayed, right? He would write, for example, how at the end of his life, he's well known for a number of his works, probably most notably longue durée history of Gaza and its strip, right? Which, ends sort of with World War One, which is a kind of geographical, archaeological history. It also gets into social, political aspects. But the end of his life, in that book, you'll find all over the place because it's published in Egypt. The last couple of books he wrote on Gazan intellectuals, Palestinian intellectuals from Gaza, one book on Hilmi Abu Sha'ban and another book on uh, Hamdi al-Husseini, the great sort of left intellectual organizer, right? Both those books were published, self-published essentially in Gaza, right? And Ubayd will say, I had to spend half my salary to do this research and to print these books. You know what I mean? This is the work that I needed to do or that I wanted to do. Now, those books, for example, his book on Hamdi al-Husseini, try to find a copy of that book. The only libraries that have that book are the National Library of Israel, right? And maybe Birzeit. Because these are things that are published in Gaza by intellectuals in Gaza, right? So I don't know how I got over there, but I'm just saying we this is it's a risk. You got to be willing to take it. You don't have to do it, but don't be surprised when people come for you.
And of course, the premise from which educators in a place like Gaza, they start their academic careers is that the acknowledgement that this is a risk. And of course, we have the example of Professor Rifat Al-Arair, who knew that they were going to target him during the genocide, so he used the last days of his life in order to tell stories and expose the aims of Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. Before I start reading some of the questions we have received from the audience, and of course, I am incredibly grateful for the discussion that's happening in the chat. I am also, we have hundreds of people tuning in on social media, and I'm really grateful for them, being with us here today. And of course, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. I will start going through them shortly. But before I do so, I want to talk about now, and I want to talk about the coming months and years. We are yet to see what kind of chilling effect this new, reality here in the United States has on its agenda. Who knows what will happen? But we have seen how some university campuses have been technically Israelized. And I went to Colombia a few months ago. They have checkpoints. They check your ID. They verify it through a database. So it's a pretty sad situation. And of course, some students are being made examples so that to create this chilling effect, educators losing their jobs and so on. Where does this leave us here at this critical moment, especially as the genocide, hopefully is coming to a halt? But even though we have a ceasefire, there is this ever expanding assault on Palestinians. What's happening in the West Bank. We have more than 40,000 Palestinians expelled from their homes, have been displaced in the past weeks. And even though the bombing, in Gaza has paused, and the death of like an average of 100 people a day has paused, this war will continue in many other manifestations. And that requires educators, students, institutions to continue to do things to address that. How do you see our role, our responsibility as people in the academic world in the coming months, in the coming years, in light of what happened in Gaza, in light of what's happening? And what are some of the concrete steps that you would propose for for our colleagues to continue these efforts despite these attacks and the targeting of voices within the academic world?
Okay, I'll go first since it's like game of chicken. I'll say I think that there's a way that this moment makes a very clear demand of all of us, which is, do you want to be passive and obedient and be overrun by a global consolidation of the right wing? Or do you want to stand for what is principled and ethical? And I think in standing for what is principled and ethical, I think, is what many, many more people are doing. And I think it is also coming out of, you're absolutely right, Jihad, that there is a kind of Israelization and the securitization of campuses, and that some of that was also already in place in response to Palestinian mobilizing, and also in response to BLM, indigenous people organizing, all of these different struggles, union organizing, right? So that if you take a look, for example, at the University of California, where I teach, almost every single year, we have had immense reasons to mobilize on campus. And the year before the genocide, basically the University of California graduate students were organizing the largest academic labor strike in US history, because many graduate students have to choose between, do I do my laundry or do I eat this week? Should I live in my apartment or should I live in my car? So I think that understanding the ways that Palestine is central to how do we stand up and fight for the very little that we have left as a demand of the moment is going to be ever escalated in the months ahead as we face a further entrenchment of the right wing. In Germany, we know that last week there was a ban on using any language but German or English in a protest. We know that the very words that we use are being policed. We know that the kind of banning of basic education in places like Florida, right? The banning of books, the shutting down of curriculum, the shutting down of all of the ways that people produce critical knowledge is here. It's happening, and it's been happening. And I think the way forward for us is to try and continue building on the many years and efforts of labor of building social movements. And the challenge that this AHA resolution puts forward, and this was something very resonant work that many of us
Seems like there is a technical issue with Shireen.
She's in Germany, so
I think, well, that speaks to the.
Am I
Shireen,
here? Do you hear me?
You froze for a second, and Asmat said you're in Germany.
Oh,
so
I'm so
you
sorry.
Probably got censored.
Sorry. Okay, it's fine. All I'm saying is the worst is yet to come. I mean, we've watched this crime scene in the White House where this real estate broker is talking to a war criminal about turning Gaza into a Riviera. Okay, that's the reality that we're facing now. And it is an entrenched politics that is going to threaten many people. And the work ahead is to continue doing the difficult labor of joint struggle.
Yeah, I think the joint struggle aspect is a major one, and it's hard in universities because academics think that they're very special, and there is a political economy that is keen on novelty, right, and cleverness, and the idea that you might need to work as a team or think beyond your own sort of individual interests or career is difficult sometimes. That's why you see the graduate students and the precarious faculty, the lecturers, the untenured faculty doing all kinds of work and taking all kinds of risks, right? While oftentimes the most, well-paid, well-established profs are the least willing, right? Because they've been socialized, right, to not do that kind of work, I think, in a big way. And one thing also I think that we need to think about in um, the coming years, especially with some of the things that Shireen was just mentioning in terms of like attacks on curriculum and tenure protections and that sort of stuff that we've kind of taken for granted to a certain extent, although not if you're a Palestinian, I guess. But there is a way that, we have to remember that for the most part, um, universities, um, institutes for knowledge production, their associated publishing arms, their associated scholarly institutions, XYZ, all that stuff in the United States and the West was built for domination, right? For the domination of the indigenous people in North America who were expelled and genocided, right? For the domination of people across a large imperial space. And these are the institutions, right? We can talk all day about Israeli institutions, and we should in this context, especially with regard to BDS and the growing sort of ways people are trying to build connections with Israeli institutions. But American universities are not just in the Cold War today, built on military contracts, built on their close relationships with technology companies, which are producing surveillance technology, military technology for domestic and so-called foreign use, right? So we need to keep that in our minds, in part because I think universities in Palestine, universities elsewhere, they're not necessarily institutions for domination, but for liberation, right? For production of our peoplehood, as Mesna mentioned. And we need to think about where what we can do as people ensconced in these kind of institutions of domination. What kind of role we can play. It's not an easy one, but it's not going to be an individual one. That's for sure.
Thank you, Asmat. I do appreciate the language on the preservation of peoplehood. Ideas that are being shared in this gathering that will form the basis for a lot of pieces that will hopefully, and spaces that we can create to expand on these points. Mazna, would you like to address this final question before we take questions from the audience?
Sure. Just really quickly, I think to think about these things, everyone has a role they can play. You just have to figure out what that role can be. Maybe you're in the academy, but your role is not in the academy. Maybe it is in your community. Maybe it is at your local library. Maybe it's at your local school council. If you are a parent or if you're a caretaker of some kind, everywhere, talk about Palestine. the most important and fundamental thing, because that is how erasure works, through processes of forgetting, elision, the moving on. When the camera stops, where does the gaze go? So that's one. The second is that there are very concrete economic ways that we, especially those of us in countries with complicities of various kinds with this genocide and with the Zionist project, can do. One of which is to demand that our institutions completely divest from arms industries. And this is where joint struggle is important, because it's not just the Israeli arms industry. All arms, there's an educational institution has no business profiting off of war, period. Point blank. Especially if your institution is a glorified hedge fund. It may not be the case for all institutions. Certainly, public universities have mechanisms of accountability that are different, sometimes better in terms of mobilization, sometimes worse. A lot of universities in the US and certainly in the UK are, operating on a bare thread, but a good number of them have a good chunk of endowment that has no business investing in arms. So that is, and so I'm thinking here about the young people throughout the last year who have done incredible research on their own institutions. They have become experts in the bureaucracy of their own institutions in order to piece out where exactly they are complicit in concrete details, to take that information that they have gathered, this archive, this movement archive, and mobilize it to make your own demands in whatever space you find yourself in. And to carry on their message beyond the attempts, the brutal attempts at suppression, at subjugation, and violence and targeting and lawfare that they're still dealing with to this day. So that is, that kind of thing, that idea that the local is not also global. Again and again and again, we go back to that local. We go back to it. Finally, I would just make the case and the plea that we also understand that the question of Palestine and our struggle for Palestine is not so much because, Palestine will be free. That is an historical inevitability in one way or another. It will be free, it may change into something else, etc. But also in this moment of the far right, of the shenanigans, of this horrific scale of warmongering, we're also trying to free ourselves wherever we are. And Palestine is a pathway to do so. We need Palestine way more, I think, fundamentally, than it ever needed us. And so to think in that way, and to think about when you invoke Palestine, you're not merely invoking the freedom of Palestine, but you're invoking your own freedom and your own liberation and your own struggle as a working class person, as a Black person, as whatever you self-identify, whatever it is that compels you politically and ideologically, it is also for you. And that is Palestine's offering also to the world.
Absolutely. And I think, thank you so much for these powerful words, everyone. And especially Mazna, these points, again, reaffirm something that many of us have been saying for a very long time, that Palestine today is a battlefield about precedents. Whatever precedents get normalized when it comes to Palestinians, these are creating dangerous precedents for the rest of us, whether concerning academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to protest and organize and engage in political opposition, and so on. So, but I will take the remaining time to address some of the questions of our audience. We have received more than 4 or 5 questions about the American Historical Association. what is to be done moving forward? What are some of the steps that you think should be done in order to resist and defy this top-down dismissal of the uh, of the resolution and of the will of the majority of the members? Um, are there Is this effort going to continue into next year's conference? So we have a lot of questions. I can't read them all, but this is basically the gist of them. What's next with regards to the American Historical Association?
So if I might just really briefly say, I would encourage people to join the people who are mobilizing precisely on this point. One organization is Historians for Peace and Democracy. Another is Historians for Palestine. We've shared both of those links, and I really do encourage that people come into community with the people who actually, some of the people who made it possible to have that room, some of the people who have made it possible for us to have this last January four or even 5 panels on Palestine, all of which were packed. People were sitting on the floor. People were ready for the analysis. I don't think we should underestimate how ready people are to be part of something that affects real concrete change. So while I totally appreciate all of the discussions on strategy, I really hope that we can take that energy and bring it into the mobilizing effort of all of the good people doing the work at Historians for Palestine and Historians for Peace and Democracy.
And our team has shared these links in the chat. So, if you missed.
Oh, and can I say one more
Yeah.
thing that I forgot? I'm so sorry. There's also a National Faculty for Justice in Palestine that over the last 16 months has now grown to having over 100 branches. So again, it's really important that we not underestimate how much power we have in terms of the kinds of people who are ready to mobilize and ready to put themselves on the line for a principled position. So I would say you can also organize there.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Mazna or Asmat, any AHA comments would you like to add to Shireen's points? No. We have a questions about what students can do about the war on academia in Gaza and how can we encourage our professors to engage in action, or maybe how can we reach out to students in Gaza and help just to protect education. It seems that this is a question from a student. Asmat, would you like to take this question?
Sorry, all right. I got bird flu, so that zoned out for a second. The question is what we can do for students in Gaza.
Yeah, support students in Gaza and encourage our professors. So this is a question from the point of view of a student, and encourage professors to engage.
I mean, I think, there is a way that universities approach student demands for boycott and divestment with offers of scholarships and visiting scholars at risk sort of things. Now, those are, there's no doubt these are not solutions to a systemic problem, but we also shouldn't denigrate those kinds of things. All right, when the university is willing to put up cash to get some really qualified students in their classrooms from Gaza, I think we shouldn't clown that, which is sometimes done in certain spaces. I think we can call it for what it is, which is an effort to undercut certain efforts for boycott and divestment. And the thing is, we can do both, right? So I think as the letter from the Gazan academics made clear, we're not looking just for a bunch of scholars at risk. We need institutional support. So as a student, I think you have to push for those things, right? You push for boycott and divestment from Israeli institutions. I mean, this is one thing that I think is sometimes missing, the depth of North American university relationships with Israeli universities. Not only do a lot of Israeli academics study in the United States, not only is there a personal relationship. Look at the don't look at both the presidents of the Israeli universities and the biggest politicians in Israel. A lot of them studied in the United States, right? So there is a direct personal relationship that is cultivated between these institutions, which of course is not there with the Palestinian institution. So we have to keep that in mind. On the other hand, there is a concentrated effort, right, to undercut standard academic practices at universities to bring in Israeli scholars and pro-Israel scholars into universities with schemes like the Israel Institute, right? And um, they are very clear in their writing that the reason we are doing that is because Middle East studies is hostile to Israel, i.e., Middle East studies has some standards with regard to truth and evidence, right? So obviously they write, there's normal stuff written about Israel, and so we need to bring pro-Israel scholars into universities to teach classes about Israel. So I think more needs to be done on that point. There needs to be there needs to be discussion, and this needs to take place within departments and within universities, at university by university level. You have 30 some centers for Israel studies in the United States, right? Every single one of those, it relies upon private philanthropy to exist, right? These are not institutions that were made through demands of faculty and students, right? This is not a center for Black studies, right? This is not a center for gender studies, right? This is something that was brought in from the outside. And I think it's not wrong for students and faculty to say, well, maybe that's not right to have this kind of propaganda outfit. You saw the kind of xenophobia, for example, that came up with regard to the Confucius Institutes a few years ago on university campuses, which were actually just teaching Chinese, language courses, right? And people are up in arms on the left and the right for these kinds of institutions. Where is the protest over the imposition of Israel studies by private philanthropy and the Israeli state in North American universities? I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Asmat. Before
I want to,
yeah,
I know where.
Shireen got censored again.
Oh, am I
No,
freezing?
no, we can hear you now.
I'm
Go
so
ahead.
sorry.
No worries.
Just really briefly, I would say for students and for all of us, read, study, center Palestine, center Palestinians in Gaza, follow their lead. Gaza is not a laboratory. It is a place full and abundant with lessons, with ideas, and with tools. And I want to hand it over to Mesna for the last word and quote her actually, which, she wrote this really beautiful piece that I cite all the time, in which she says, the only way we will lose Gaza is if we stop listening to Palestinians in Gaza.
Yes, exactly. And that there are many different voices in Gaza, and they're saying many things to us, all important, all valuable, and it's a conversation. And may we continue to have a conversation with our people in Gaza and our people all over Palestine. The genocide has only expanded and grown.
Thank you so much, Mazna. And as I wrap up, I want to express my deepest gratitude to our panelists, Dr. Shireen Saiqali, Dr. Asmat Al-Halabi, and Dr. Mazna Qatu for sharing their insights and powerful words and reflections. And finally, I want to thank all of you, the audience, for joining us, engaging, and continuing this critical work beyond today's event. We encourage you to stay connected and involved, and for those who want to continue the conversation, our team, who I would like to thank, very much, has shared some of the resources that were listed in the chat on our different social media pages, mainly on the one on Twitter or X, whatever it's called. So thank you all for joining. Thank you again for being here, and we hope to continue this conversation in the future. Take care and goodbye.